He fell for a woman unlike any he had ever known, but shame spoke louder. Under judging gazes, he humiliated her and threw her out of her own store. What he didn't know was that this woman had the power to destroy everything he had built. Now his fortune is crumbling, and his luxury empire is in the hands of the one he despised. Comment where you're watching this video from and subscribe to the channel. The reflection in the crystal mirror showed exactly what Richard Morgan expected to see. Perfection. His tailored Italian suit fit impeccably on his broad shoulders, the result of years of private gym sessions. At 45, he maintained his salt and pepper hair strategically trimmed, conveying the image of power and sophistication he so valued. It was just another ordinary day at the helm of Crystal, the most prestigious luxury fashion chain in the United States. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The businessman crossed the mirrored hallway of his penthouse in Tribeca, one of the most upscale neighborhoods in New York City, while checking the latest messages on his state-of-the-art smartphone. The numbers didn't lie. Crystal had broken another sales record in the last quarter. His 15 stores spread across the most exclusive locations in the country were frequented only by the cream of American society. Mr. Morgan, the meeting with investors will begin in 20 minutes, announced his personal assistant Victoria through the intercom. With her typical impeccable posture, she was already waiting for him in the building lobby with a folder containing all the necessary reports. During the journey to the company headquarters, Richard observed the city through the bulletproof windows of his Mercedes. New York was his kingdom, and Crystal his crown. Each window display of his stores was meticulously planned to convey a clear message. There was no room for the ordinary, for the mediocre. Beauty was a requirement, not an option. The numbers for the last quarter exceeded all expectations, commented Victoria, flipping through the reports. The new customer selection policies were a success. Richard smiled discreetly. The selection policies were his most recent innovation, a veiled system that ensured only people within certain aesthetic standards were served in his stores. It wasn't discrimination, he told himself. It was brand preservation. Upon arriving at Crystal's headquarters, an imposing building on Fifth Avenue, Richard was greeted with the usual reverence. Employees perfectly aligned with the company's standards greeted him with rehearsed smiles. In the meeting room, the country's biggest investors awaited him for another presentation of results. "Gentlemen," he began, his deep voice filling the room, "Crystal is not just a luxury brand. It's a lifestyle, a statement of who we are and what we value." The next 2 hours were dedicated to graphs, projections, and strategies. Richard dominated that environment like a maestro before his orchestra. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, each gesture calculated to maximize its impact. At the end of the meeting, new investments were secured. Crystal would expand its presence to 3 more state capitals in the coming months. The empire was growing, and with it, the ego of its creator. "Schedule a lunch with the marketing team," he ordered Victoria as they returned to his office. "I want to discuss the new campaign. We need to reinforce our identity even more." Seated in his Italian leather chair, Richard contemplated the view of the city through the windows of the 20th floor. His reflection in the glass made him smile. He had built all of that following a simple philosophy. Appearance is everything. Since childhood, he had learned from his parents that beauty opened doors, that aesthetic perfection was the path to success. The sun was beginning to set over New York when Richard finally decided to end his day. Tomorrow would be the inauguration of another Crystal store, this time in the Soho neighborhood, and he insisted on personally supervising the final details. His empire was in constant expansion, and each new store was another jewel in his crystal crown. Little did he know that fate had marked an unexpected encounter for the following day, an encounter that would shake the foundations of everything he had built with such care. The morning of the inauguration began like all others in Richard Morgan's life, meticulously planned. The new Crystal store in Soho was his most recent masterpiece. The 5,000 square foot space had been transformed into a temple of luxury, with Italian marble flooring, imported crystal chandeliers, and mirrors that seemed to multiply the environment to infinity. The employees, all selected not only for their experience but also for their appearance, moved like pieces in a perfectly choreographed ballet. Each one knew their role, every gesture had been rehearsed. The first hour would be reserved only for VIP clients, carefully selected and personally invited. That's when she entered. Helen Rhodes walked through the glass doors of crystal without knowing she was about to change the course of several lives, including her own. At 35, she carried a confidence that came from within, which had nothing to do with the standards established by the fashion industry. Her curvy body was elegantly dressed in a navy blue tailored suit, and her natural curly hair framed a face that radiated intelligence and determination. The salespeople exchanged nervous glances. This woman clearly wasn't on the VIP list, and her body type didn't correspond to the crystal profile. But before anyone could approach the intruder, Richard Morgan emerged from his private office at the back of the store. Something about Helen's posture intrigued him. Unlike the people who normally frequented his stores, she didn't seem intimidated by the luxurious environment. Her eyes scanned the pieces with genuine, analytical, almost professional interest. "Can I help you?" asked Richard, surprising everyone present. It wasn't common to see him approach clients personally. Helen turned and their eyes met. "Actually, you can," she responded with a serene smile. "I'm trying to understand the concept of this store. It's fascinating how you managed to create such an exclusive atmosphere. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing. The frankness of her response caught him off guard. There was no hostility in her voice, just a disconcerting honesty. "Exclusive is a strong word," Richard replied, feeling strangely compelled to prolong that conversation. "We prefer to say we're selective." "And what's the criterion for this selection?" asked Helen, her eyes fixed on his. "Because from what I observe, it doesn't seem to be purchasing power." A small audience was beginning to form discreetly. Around them, VIP clients and employees observed the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Crystal has a very clear identity," explained Richard, maintaining his professional tone, but feeling inexplicably attracted to the intelligence emanating from this woman. "Our clients share that identity." "Ah, yes. The famous identity based on appearances," Helen smiled, picking up one of the most expensive pieces from the new collection. "You know what the problem with Crystal is, Mr. Morgan. Richard Morgan. Mr. Morgan. The problem with Crystal is that despite its beauty, it's extremely fragile. A single blow in the right place and the entire structure shatters." The comment hit Richard like a precise arrow. For the first time in years, he felt disarmed in his own territory. This woman, whom his standards would classify as inadequate, challenged him with an elegance that no designer clothes could buy. The conversation could have continued for hours, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Vance, his biggest investor. The businessman, known for his conservatism and poorly disguised prejudices, cast a look of disapproval at the scene he was witnessing. "Richard, my dear," exclaimed Vance with false joviality. "I didn't know we were already serving the general public. I thought this first hour would be exclusive." It was as if a spell had been broken. Suddenly, Richard returned to the reality of his world of appearances. The looks of those present, the weight of expectations, everything he had built over the years, seemed to weigh on his shoulders. The smile on Richard Morgan's face transformed into a cold mask. Marcus Vance's comment had awakened in him an acute awareness of what was at stake. Years of building an image, millions in investments, everything could be questioned because of that moment of weakness. "You're right, Marcus," Richard replied, his voice assuming an icy tone. "In fact, there was a misunderstanding here." He turned to Helen, who was observing him with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this is a private occasion. I don't know how you managed to get in, but I must ask you to leave." Helen maintained her dignified posture, but her eyes betrayed the hurt caused by the sudden change in attitude. "Interesting. How quickly you confirm everything I just said about your establishment." "Security," called Richard. his voice echoing through the now silent environment. "Please escort this lady to the exit, and make sure she understands she's not welcome in any of our stores." Two security guards approached, but before they could touch her, Helen raised her hand in an elegant gesture of dismissal. "It won't be necessary. I've understood perfectly well what kind of place this is." She turned to the VIP clients watching the scene. "Congratulations to all of you. You've managed to create an environment as superficial as the material that gives the brand its name." As she headed towards the exit, Richard felt an inexplicable impulse to call her back, to apologize, to explain that he wasn't that person. But the discreet giggles of his VIP guests and Marcus Vance's approving look kept him paralyzed. "Good thing you put that woman in her place," commented Vance, patting his shoulder. "Imagine if this becomes a trend. Before you know it, we'd have all sorts of people wanting to frequent Crystal." The investor's words provoked murmurs of agreement among those present, but sounded hollow to Richard's ears. Something inside him had broken at that moment, even if he didn't yet know how to identify what it was. The inauguration proceeded as planned. Champagne was served, contracts were signed, fake smiles were exchanged. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had made an irreparable mistake. That night, in his apartment, he found himself going over the day's events in his mind. The way Helen had challenged him, how her eyes shone with intelligence and dignity, how her presence had, for a few moments, made his whole world of appearances seem ridiculously artificial. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," he murmured to himself, remembering the words his grandmother used to repeat. For the first time in years, he questioned the values that guided his life. He took his tablet and began to search for information about Helen. He didn't know her last name, but he was sure that a woman with that presence would leave traces. However, his searches were fruitless. It was as if she had simply disappeared. The days that followed brought a growing restlessness. Richard found himself looking for Helen's face in every person who passed through his stores. Her words about the fragility of Crystal echoed in his mind like a prophecy, but the universe has a peculiar way of teaching its lessons. While Richard tried to bury the memory of that encounter under layers of work and social commitments, Helen was about to resurface in a way that would shake the foundations of his Crystal empire. In his office on the top floor of the Crystal building, Richard couldn't imagine that his actions that day would be the catalyst for a transformation that would affect not only his life, but the entire fashion market in the United States. The humiliation he imposed on Helen would be the first domino in a sequence that he himself had set in motion. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. While the Crystal Empire continued its apparent ascent, Helen Rhodes was preparing for a silent revolution in her office on the 10th floor of a commercial building in Greenwich Village. The environment, although luxurious, conveyed a completely different atmosphere from Richard Morgan's stores. It was a welcoming space, with comfortable furniture and works of art that celebrated American diversity. "Ms. Rhodes, the latest market. Research reports have arrived," announced her assistant Julia, entering the room with a folder full of documents. "And the responses are exactly what we expected." Helen smiled, leafing through the papers with interest. Heiress to the Rhodes Group, one of the largest textile conglomerates in North America, she had spent the last few years discreetly studying the American luxury fashion market. Her experience at Crystal hadn't been an accident. It was field research. "Look at these numbers, Julia," she commented, pointing to a graph. 70% of American women don't feel represented by existing luxury brands, and 85% would like to have access to high-quality clothes that value them as they are. The project Helen had been developing in secret was much bigger than a simple revenge against Richard Morgan. It was the realization of a dream she had cultivated since she took over as vice president of the Rhodes Group, to create a brand that would revolutionize the concept of luxury in the country. "The contracts with the designers have already been signed," continued Julia, handing over more documents. All of them embraced the concept of Essence. Essence would be the name of the new brand, a name chosen to represent exactly the opposite of what Crystal symbolized. While one valued only appearance, the other would celebrate the true beauty of each woman. "And the modeling?" asked Helen, getting up to examine the prototypes displayed on mannequins of various sizes and shapes, tested and approved. Each piece was developed thinking about enhancing different body types. The Rhodes Group's textile technology allowed us to create fabrics that perfectly adapt to any silhouette. Helen ran her hand over a silk dress. The quality was unquestionable, worthy of the most prestigious international brands. But there was something more there, a special care for comfort, practicality, for the reality of American women. "How long until we're ready for the launch?" she asked, turning her attention to the calendar on her desk. 3 months, replied Julia, consulting her agenda. The concept stores in the main cities are already in the final phase of renovation. The advertising campaign is ready to be aired, and the e-commerce is in final testing. Helen nodded, satisfied. Her strategy had been meticulously planned, unlike Crystal, which prided itself on being exclusive. Essence would be born with a national presence and accessible prices, without compromising on quality. "You know, Julia," said Helen, looking out the window at the bustling Greenwich Village, "that day at Crystal was a watershed moment. Seeing up close how a brand can be cruel in its exclusion gave me even more certainty that we're on the right path." Julia, who had worked with Helen for years and knew her story, smiled. "You turned humiliation into motivation." "It's not about revenge," Helen gently corrected. "It's about change, about showing that there's another way, that luxury can be inclusive, that quality can be democratic, that fashion can be for everyone." At that moment, her cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was a report on Crystal's latest stock market actions. The numbers showed a stability that would soon be shaken. "They have no idea what's coming," murmured Julia. Helen shook her head. "It's not about them, Julia. It's about all the women who have ever felt diminished, excluded or inadequate. It's about showing that there's room for all of us in the fashion world." The sun was beginning to set over New York, casting a golden light over the office. In 3 months, the American fashion market would meet a new force, one that wasn't based on exclusion, but on inclusion. And Helen Rhodes, the woman Richard Morgan had considered inadequate for his store, was about to prove that true beauty has no standard. The morning of Essence's launch dawned with a different energy in New York. Strategically positioned billboards on the main avenues displayed real women of different body types, all wearing sophisticated pieces that seemed to have been tailor-made for each of them. The advertising campaign had been carefully planned to cause immediate impact. "The line started forming 5 hours ago," reported Julia, showing live images of the 10 concept stores that would be inaugurated simultaneously in different state capitals. "And the website already registers over 100,000 hits even before the official launch." Helen observed everything from her office transformed into a command center. Large screens showed the different units, while a team monitored social media and e-commerce. The digital marketing strategy had created a buzz in the previous weeks, with influencers of different profiles receiving exclusive previews of the collection. "Is the manifesto ready to be published?" asked Helen, adjusting her navy blue blazer, the same one she had worn that day at Crystal. "Yes, ma'am. As soon as you give the signal, it will be released on all channels." The manifesto was an open letter to the fashion market, signed by Helen Rhodes, presenting not only Essence but also her vision for a more inclusive industry. It was a document that she knew would cause shockwaves in the sector. At 10 a.m. sharp, the doors of the stores were opened simultaneously. The images that arrived were impressive. Women of all ages, sizes and styles, entering an environment that celebrated them. The fitting rooms were spacious and comfortable, with mirrors that didn't distort the image. The saleswomen, also of different profiles, had been trained to be true style consultants. "The first feedbacks are coming in," announced one of the social media analysts. "The hashtag Essence for All is already trending." Helen smiled as she saw the comments. Women sharing their experiences, celebrating the possibility of finding high-quality clothes that made them feel beautiful and confident. It was exactly what she had dreamed of. On the other side of the city, at Crystal's headquarters, Richard Morgan observed with growing concern the news about Essence's launch. Something about that brand deeply bothered him, but he still couldn't identify what it was. "Mr. Morgan," called Victoria, his assistant, with a worried expression. "Essence's manifesto has just been published. I think you should read it." Richard took the tablet and began to read. With each word, his face grew paler. The text didn't explicitly mention the incident at Crystal, but made clear references to the exclusionary standards of the luxury fashion industry. The signature at the end of the document was like a punch to his stomach. Helen Rhodes, CEO of Essence and Vice President of the Rhodes Group. "This isn't possible," he muttered, sinking into his Italian leather chair. The woman he had humiliated wasn't a simple customer. She was one of the most powerful executives in the country's textile sector. Back at Essence, Helen was receiving the first sales reports. In just 2 hours, e-commerce had surpassed all projections. The physical stores reported constant lines and an extraordinary conversion rate. "Helen," called Julia, with a discreet smile. "Crystal just issued a press release trying to minimize our impact on the market." "Let them," Helen responded, serene. "Our focus isn't on competing with anyone. It's on creating something new, something that makes a difference in people's lives." The day progressed, and social media exploded with emotional testimonials from customers. Women who had never felt welcome in luxury stores shared their positive experiences. Essence wasn't just selling clothes, it was changing paradigms. 3 months after Essence's launch, the American luxury fashion market had changed drastically. What began as a new brand quickly transformed into a cultural movement. Crystal's sales, which initially seemed immune to the new competition, were beginning to show worrying signs of decline. Richard Morgan was in his office, staring at the latest edition of Vogue America. On the cover, Helen Rhodes smiled confidently, wearing one of Essence's best-selling pieces. The headline was direct: "The Revolution of American Fashion." "Sales have dropped 30% in the last month," Victoria informed, placing the reports on his desk. "And we've just lost 2 more exclusivity contracts with European suppliers. They claim that the association with our brand could harm their image in the current market." The businessman ran his hand through his graying hair, now visibly whiter due to the stress of recent months. Crystal, which had always been synonymous with status and exclusivity, was being portrayed on social media as a symbol of outdated elitism. "The video from that day," Victoria began hesitantly, "is circulating again." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the moment he humiliated Helen in his store. Some VIP client had discreetly recorded the scene, and now the video resurfaced periodically on social media, always generating a new wave of criticism towards Crystal. Meanwhile, in Essence's office, Helen was conducting a meeting with her expanded team. The brand had grown far beyond initial expectations, requiring an increasingly larger structure. The mentorship program has already impacted more than 1,000 women entrepreneurs, Julia reported, presenting the numbers from the company's latest social project. Essence wasn't limited to selling clothes. It had created a support network for women who wanted to start businesses in the fashion market. "And the partnerships with independent ateliers?" Helen questioned, leafing through the sustainability report. "We've exceeded the goal. 50 small producers have already been integrated into our production chain, all following our quality and social responsibility standards." The contrast between the two companies couldn't be greater. While Crystal increasingly closed itself off in its exclusive world, Essence expanded organically and inclusively. The decision to maintain accessible prices, even using top-tier materials, had proven correct. The sales volume more than compensated for the smaller margins. "We've just received another international partnership proposal," Julia announced, handing an envelope to Helen. "One of the largest department store chains in Europe wants to bring Essence to the European market." Helen smiled, remembering how it all began. The humiliation she suffered could have made her give up, but instead, it transformed into fuel for a much bigger change. Back at Crystal, Richard faced a tense meeting with his main investors. Marcus Vance, the same one who had encouraged Helen's exclusion, now led a group demanding drastic changes. "We need to adapt, Richard," Vance insisted. his previous arrogance replaced by desperate pragmatism. The market has changed. If we continue like this, we'll sink. Adapt? Richard questioned bitterly. You mean abandon everything we've built? Everything we've stood for years? I mean survive, Vance replied dryly. Essence isn't just selling more. It's changing the way people think about fashion and luxury. Either we adapt or we disappear. Helen's words from that fateful day echoed in Richard's mind. The problem with crystal is that, despite its beauty, it's extremely fragile. Now he fully understood the meaning of that metaphor. The New York autumn painted the streets with shades of orange when Richard Morgan finally admitted his defeat. The numbers didn't lie. Crystal was in free fall. 3 stores had already closed, and the forecasts for the next quarter were even more gloomy. I got her contact, Victoria informed, placing a card on his desk. But Helen Rhodes only accepts meetings on her own territory. Richard stared at the elegant card with the Essence logo. The idea of going to her as a supplicant hurt his pride, but there was no alternative. The banks were beginning to pressure, and suppliers were demanding increasingly greater guarantees. Essence's building in Greenwich Village was different from anything Richard expected. There wasn't the ostentatious luxury of Crystal, but a discreet and welcoming elegance. In the reception, people of different profiles moved naturally, all wearing pieces from the brand. Mr. Morgan, Julia greeted with professionalism. Ms. Rhodes will receive you in 5 minutes. Please make yourself comfortable. The waiting room had magazines scattered on a center table. All featured articles about Essence's success. One highlighted the company's professional training program, which had already trained hundreds of seamstresses and designers. She's ready to receive you, Julia announced after a few minutes. Helen's office was a reflection of her business philosophy. Spacious and well-lit, decorated with works by American artists, it conveyed a sense of comfort without sacrificing sophistication. Richard, Helen greeted, rising from her desk. She wore an ensemble from Essence's new collection that made her look even more imposing than he remembered. I confess I didn't expect your visit so soon. Helen, he hesitated, realizing he hadn't rehearsed his words. I came to propose a partnership. A subtle smile formed on her lips. Partnership? The last time we met, you made it very clear that we didn't share the same values. Things have changed, he admitted, swallowing his pride. The market has changed. Crystal needs to adapt, and no one understands this new moment better than you. Helen indicated an armchair and sat in the other. And what kind of partnership do you have in mind? A merger, Richard replied, taking a folder from his briefcase. Crystal has an established structure, international suppliers, prime locations. With your vision and our infrastructure, we could... No, Helen interrupted gently. I think you don't understand, Richard. Essence doesn't need Crystal. We already have everything we need, and more importantly, we have something you never had. Purpose. Richard felt the weight of those words. In a few months, this woman he had publicly humiliated had built something much bigger than a fashion empire. She had started a revolution. So that's it, he asked, his voice betraying a touch of desperation. You're going to watch Crystal sink? Helen stood up and walked to the window. You know what the difference between us is, Richard? When you humiliated me in that store, it wasn't out of malice. It was out of fear. Fear of losing control, of seeing your perfect world questioned. Now you're here with the same fear, seeking salvation. But that's not how real changes happen. 2 weeks after the meeting with Helen, Richard found himself alone in his apartment, contemplating the city through the windows of his penthouse. That morning's news had been devastating. Crystal's stocks plummeted 45% after the announcement of 3 more store closures. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was creditors, investors, journalists, all wanting explanations, guarantees, interviews. But for the first time in his life, Richard Morgan had no answers. Sir, called his housekeeper Maria, interrupting his thoughts. Ms. Victoria is here. She says it's urgent. Victoria entered the apartment carrying a folder and a grave expression. Richard, we need to talk. The Rhodes Group just made an offer for Crystal. What? He asked, taking the documents she was extending. They want to buy the company. It's not a merger, it's a complete acquisition. The value, well, it's far below what we were worth 6 months ago, but considering the current situation..." Richard silently leafed through the documents. The conditions were clear. The Rhodes Group, through Essence, would buy Crystal for a value that barely covered its debts. The brand would be completely restructured, keeping only the physical infrastructure and some key employees. "And what about me?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "You would receive a generous severance package, but you would no longer have any stake in the company." The following morning, Richard headed to Essence's headquarters for the second time. This time there was no wounded pride in his steps, only the clarity of someone who finally sees reality. Helen received him in her office, where a team of executives from the Rhodes Group was already waiting. The meeting was surprisingly brief. Richard signed the documents without contesting, handing over his crystal empire to the woman he had once belittled. "You know what's ironic?" Helen commented after everyone had left, leaving them alone. "You built Crystal based on exclusion, on the idea that some people weren't worthy of being part of that world. In the end, it was exactly that mentality that destroyed your empire." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of each word. "What are you going to do with the brand?" Transform. Just as you need to transform yourself, Richard. This isn't a sentence. It's an opportunity for a new beginning. In the months that followed, Richard observed from afar the metamorphosis of Crystal. The old stores, once temples of exclusivity, were renovated to become welcoming spaces. The name remained, but its meaning changed. Now it represented transparency, clarity of purpose. Helen kept her word. The transformation was complete. The former employees who shared the exclusionary vision were replaced by a diverse and well-trained team. The window displays, once populated by identical mannequins, began to celebrate human diversity. On a spring afternoon, Richard passed in front of the old Soho store where it had all begun. In place of the cold and intimidating environment, he found a vibrant space, full of life. Through the glass, he saw women of different ages, sizes, and styles being treated with respect and attention. 6 months had passed since the acquisition of Crystal by the Rhodes Group. Richard Morgan, after weeks of deep reflection, made a decision that surprised everyone. He enrolled in an inclusive fashion management course at the prestigious Parsons School of Design in New York. During his classes, he constantly encountered examples of Essence's success, now an international case study of luxury market transformation. The model created by Helen had inspired changes in traditional brands around the world. "Mr. Morgan," his professor called after a class on social responsibility in fashion, "your unique perspective on business transformation would be valuable to our students. Would you like to share your experience?" For the first time in a long time, Richard felt he had something truly important to teach, not about exclusion and appearances, but about humility and change. In New York, Essence continued its meteoric expansion. Helen had just launched an incubation program for small independent brands, offering mentoring and support for entrepreneurs who shared her vision of inclusive fashion. "The numbers for the last quarter exceeded all expectations," Julia reported during a board meeting. "The merger of operations with the former Crystal allowed us to reach an even larger audience, maintaining our essence and values." Helen proudly observed the empire she had built. It wasn't just about clothes or profits, it was about social transformation. Her stores had become spaces of empowerment, where women felt truly welcomed and valued. On a sunny afternoon, she received an unexpected email from Richard. He shared his experiences in New York and how the course was changing his worldview. At the end of the message, there was a sincere apology for the past and an interesting proposal. "He wants to create a scholarship program," Helen explained to Julia, "for young designers from underprivileged communities to study fashion in New York." "And what do you think?" her assistant questioned. Helen smiled, remembering her own journey. "I think every transformation deserves a chance." The news of the scholarship program quickly spread through the market. Richard Morgan, the former symbol of elitism in American fashion, was investing his personal fortune in training a new generation of designers, focusing on diversity and inclusion. The old crystal stores, now completely remodeled, became symbols of a new era. The mirrors that once served to judge and exclude now reflected genuine smiles. The fitting rooms, once places of anxiety, transformed into spaces for celebrating individuality. "We did it," Helen whispered to herself, observing from her office window the movement of happy customers entering and leaving Essence's flagship store. "We managed to change not just fashion, but the way people see themselves." 1 year after Crystal's transformation, Helen organized a special event to celebrate Essence's international expansion. The chosen location couldn't be more significant. The old Soho store, now completely renovated where it had all begun. The space was unrecognizable. The old cold walls gave way to a welcoming environment, with works by American artists decorating every corner. Photographs of real women wearing pieces from the brand replaced the old standardized images. Among the guests, a familiar figure caught Helen's attention. Richard Morgan had returned from his studies especially for the event. He was no longer the arrogant businessman from before. His eyes carried a new light, a deeper understanding of the world. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," he commented, approaching Helen with a genuine smile. "You managed to create something extraordinary here." "We managed," she gently corrected. "Your transformation is also part of this story." The event brought together people from all sectors of fashion. Independent designers who had been supported by Essence's incubation program, young talents who were about to embark for New York with the scholarships created by Richard, loyal customers who had followed the brand's entire journey. "You know," Richard began, observing the diversity of people circulating through the environment, "that day when we met, you said something about Crystal being fragile. You were right on so many levels." Helen smiled, remembering that crucial moment. "Sometimes we need to break to rebuild ourselves stronger." The highlight of the night was the fashion show celebrating Essence's new collection. On the runway, women of different ages, bodies, and ethnicities presented pieces that were true works of art, created to enhance the unique beauty of each one. Among the models was Maria, Richard's former housekeeper. She walked with natural elegance, wearing a dress that made her shine. Her eyes met those of her ex-employer in the audience, and they shared a knowing smile. At the end of the show, Helen took the stage for a brief speech. "Fashion has the power to transform not just how we dress, but how we see ourselves and how we see the world. Tonight we celebrate not just the success of a brand, but the victory of an idea, that there is room for everyone to shine." After the guests began to disperse, Helen and Richard remained at the venue, contemplating the space that had witnessed so much of their stories. "And now?" he asked, genuinely curious about the future. "Now we continue transforming lives," Helen responded with conviction. "One person at a time, one story at a time." As they walked out of the store, the last rays of the setting sun streamed through the windows, creating a spectacle of lights and colors. Crystal, once a symbol of fragility and exclusion, now reflected the light of a new era, an era of inclusion, respect, and celebration of diversity. Helen and Richard's story wasn't just about fashion or business. It was about transformation, about the human capacity to evolve, and about how sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true purpose. And so, as the lights went out in the old crystal store, a new story began to be written, no longer in fragile crystal, but in the unshakable essence of respect and inclusion.